Good evening, I'm John. I'm the event director at Literati Bookstore. We're pleased to welcome Susannah Cahalan, author of The Great Pretender, the undercover mission that changed our understanding of madness, in conversation tonight with journalist Maureen Callahan, author of American Predator, The Hunt for the Most Meticulous Serial Killer in the 21st Century. Just a reminder of our Zoom etiquette. You are muted. You came into the event muted. You will stay that way. We just ask that you leave your video off as well through the duration of the event. Speaker view is the ideal way to experience things so that you're not just seeing our speakers in very tiny squares, but taking up your whole screen. So if you're trying to figure out the best way to experience it tonight, that's what we recommend. Following the conversation, we'll have time for a Q&A, and you can feel free to ask me questions in the chat or ask your questions to me in the chat. The chat is closed to the public, but you can send me your questions at any time, and I encourage you to do so. And then I will come back on at the conclusion of the conversation to ask those questions. As a reminder, you can purchase our authors' books tonight on our website, and I'll include a link in the chat for that. And if you're watching later on YouTube, I can do the YouTuber thing and say you can purchase books in the link below. Yes, yes. And select titles, if you live in Southeast Michigan, are available for curbside pickup. And in lieu of a book purchase, we also ask that you consider a $5 donation to sustain our virtual programming. Whether you'd like to think of that as this week's or this month's or this year's subscription to our programming, which will potentially remain virtual for some time, you can make donations at literatibookstore.com/donation. Otherwise, we simply thank you for your attendance this evening or morning or afternoon, depending on where in the world you are zooming in from. So without further ado, Susannah Cahalan is the award-winning New York Times bestselling author of Brain on Fire, My Month of Madness, a memoir about her struggle with a rare autoimmune disease of the brain. She writes for the New York Post. Her work has also been featured in the New York Times, Scientific American Magazine, Glamour, Psychology Today, and other publications. She lives in Brooklyn. And Maureen Callahan is an award-winning investigative journalist, author, columnist, and commentator. She has covered everything from pop culture to politics. Her writing has appeared in Vanity Fair, New York Spin, and the New York Post, where she is critic at large. She lives in New York as well. Please use your Zoom clap reaction function to help me welcome Susannah and Maureen to your living rooms.
Hello. First of all, before we begin and talk about our books, can I just tell you, Maureen, Maureen wrote a column last week about Johnny Depp and what's going on. I don't know how many people are familiar with what's going on with the divorce trial between Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, but it's right? No, right? No,
when the libel trial, actually, it's playing out like a divorce trial.
Exactly. But your column was fantastic because
thank you.
Because actually Maureen's first book, actually your second book, was a book called Champion Supernovas. And that talks a lot about, the kind of era in which Johnny Depp became the kind of Johnny Depp we knew and loved. And you put it so beautifully. How are you feeling about it now? Everything.
Thank you. I feel like there are very few gifts in quarantine to distract us. And today's, not to get off track, but like today's trial, it's all like excrement and bodily fluids. It's just disgusting. There's and there's no bar that's too low for them to and my favorite part of it is they come in and leave the courthouse like waving to their fans like it's a movie premiere. Yeah. They haven't just been talking about discovering human excrement in the marital bed. Yeah. Lovely to see you.
Oh, it's fantastic.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
So Maureen's columns are always something that you should check out. If you,
thank you.
If you don't read Maureen's columns in the New York Post, you should. Okay, we should probably talk about our books. That's why we're here. I am the author of The Great Pretender, which just came out in paperback yesterday. And that is just kind of a short spiel. Oh my gosh, this book has a baby bite out of it. Wow. Okay. All right. This book is, it's interesting because I was thinking about the ways in which Maureen's book and my book dovetail, but I think a big part of it is that there's an investigation at the core. And in my book, it starts with the premise surrounding one very famous study in the 1970s where people went undercover in psychiatric hospitals. And this study was very embarrassing to the history in psychiatry at the time and had a huge effect on how it's practiced today. And I came in as a kind of fan of the study. And through the course of about 6 years of working on it, which you worked on your book for about a similar amount of time, I learned things that would very much question some of the conclusions of the study and the author of the study himself, and kind of raise questions about some of the changes enacted in the field of psychiatry in general. So it's a very research-based book, but I really wrote it as kind of a true crime book in some ways. And I think that kind of dovetails nicely with Maureen's book, which just to describe it briefly, is a true crime book, but also is kind of elevates beyond the genre of the kind of typical true crime book. I think you would agree with that. Maureen.
Thank you.
Yes. Well, so you please introduce American Predator as well, which I don't have.
I wish I had my copy. I didn't bring mine, but my book also just came out in paperback. Thank you, Susannah, for being prepared. And when I was thinking about this, I had the exact same thought that your book and mine are actually more similar than they might appear on the surface. Yours is set in the world of academia, and it unfolds, though, like a very slow-moving horror story, right? And so much of the terror is internal. You know, you are really getting at, I think, two very important questions. One is, what is the nature of madness? And two, is this revered figure in American psychiatry a fraud? And my book also is a detective story, but much as yours unfolded in ways you couldn't see coming. And, you know, you would sort of find yourself in, because, you know, we would speak a fair amount while we were working on our books. And we were each on sort of parallel tracks. You know, I was learning that my mystery was far deeper and more complicated and actually involved obstruction by the FBI and by the federal government. And why was this? And so I think that the payoff, hopefully for readers of both of our books, is that you find yourself enmeshed in multiple mysteries.
Totally. And I love that too. And I think, you know, your book starts very vividly at the center of the nightmare, right? We are in an abduction case. It's the kind of worst thing you can imagine happening to someone. But when you get deeper, it's not only the nightmare of the kind of horror show of this serial killer, but it's the nightmare of the institution behind it that kind of enabled this behavior. And you could argue in some ways ineptitudes led to this person killing more people. So the nightmare starts very vividly in the front and center, but actually is kind of more deeper inlaid in the story. Whereas I think mine starts less like the nightmare on the surface and then goes deeper. So there's that kind of parallel track in ours too, where it's kind of, you know, a layered expose that starts on one note and kind of ends on a very different note, I think. And, you know, you and I mean, we spent almost the exact amount of time working on, I think we sold our proposals. And just an aside about nonfiction is that you don't sell a whole book, you sell a proposal. And it's kind of a promise of a book. And oftentimes that promise of a book does not look anything like the kind of final version that comes out. And I think Maureen and I sold our books around the same time. And it'd be really interesting to go back and look at those proposals, because you read my proposal and I read your proposal. And it's interesting to think, I mean, in my proposal, I did not know that the person I was kind of, you know, putting the infrastructure of the book around, a person named David Rosenhan, would turn out to be so slippery. I had no idea. And I think in your case, some of the heroes in your narrative that you thought you were going to be kind of hanging your case around ended up being far more complicated too. Is that fair to say?
I think that's completely fair to say. Some of them, in fact, turned out to be villains. You know, I sort of talk about it as, you know, the FBI wound up hunting this serial killer, the likes of which they had never seen before. And in my experience of reporting it and in writing it, at first it seemed like, well, it's a very clear-cut good guys, bad guy scenario. And it's almost cinematic, like classically American cinematic definition of good and bad. And then they get him in a room and suddenly another villain emerges. And that villain is ostensibly on the side of the good guys, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what I loved about what was going on with The Great Pretender is I remember because this was in the before times when we would be in an office
Yes.
and sitting at desks.
Hugging and kissing people, which seems so foreign. You know?
I know, never again. But I remember you, my recollection is, correct me if I'm wrong, but my recollection is you were really concerned. You were like, oh my God, I don't think he is who he's supposed to be. I don't think he's who I thought. I think this might not be the bedrock of psychiatry that I think it is. And I remember going, this is the best thing that could happen. This is so much more interesting. Yeah. And you really you went at it like it was like you were leading your own investigation, and you did it almost all on your own. I remember like you hired a private detective, and I was like, that is like, should I do that? You know, because
it's a war against the FBI and got a bunch of stuff unsealed. So you carried out your own intensive investigation. You didn't even need to hire a private investigator. And honestly, I don't think a private investigator would have gotten more than you had gotten. They didn't in my case.
That's possible. I actually hired a First Amendment lawyer, which is my version of your PI. Right. But much like I also think what dovetails about our stories, our books, is that for me, at a certain point, I knew that the crux of trying to get to what made this serial killer the way he was, like how did he get built this way, was getting the sealed psych eval.
Yes.
And that was like my Rosetta Stone. And I got it really close to my final deadline, really close. And that opened up so much for me. And I feel like both of our books, you know, at heart are really about like the mystery of what it is to be human.
Yeah.
The mystery of what it is to be sane or insane. And how thin that membrane can be sometimes. And even in dipping your toe into this world, whether you're one of like Rosenhan's students who say, I'm going to go try to get myself admitted to an asylum under the pretense that I think I'm mentally ill, or you are a criminal profiler with the FBI, one of the top ones, and this is what you specialize in, and you still can't answer the question, how are psychopaths among us? Are they born or are they made? And if we can answer that question, can we somehow, if not ameliorate psychopathy, eradicate it?
Right. You know, it's so interesting. That's another thing I was thinking about, an overlap between our two books. And I do want you to, at some point, just introduce Israel Keyes and the crimes that have been associated with him, but also the ones that may meet now through this book and through people knowing about him. You might actually lead to solving some cases, which is amazing. But more to your point about this question of what is mental illness, what is madness, I thought, yes, I mean, your book, when I was reading it through that prism, because when we think about the horrors that Israel Keyes enacted on his victims, you'll think only an insane person, in that kind of very loose term, could do that. But the fact is, according to pretty much all the definitions used in a court of law, he would not be insane. So there's different layers of what is insanity, what is sanity in the context of the courts, what's it in the context of psychiatric hospitals, what's it in the context of a hospital, and what's it in the context of the popular culture. So it's not even just one definition that we're after, it's a definition that changes, you know, according to who's asking it. So it's a really kind of slippery, interesting questions that I think both of our books really do grapple with deeply. But before we move on, I do want you to kind of talk about Israel Keyes a bit and introduce him to people who might not be aware of who he is.
So briefly, Israel Keyes was this unprecedented serial killer who had no victim type. He had no sort of circumscribed geographical location, as most serial killers do. He had this diabolical MO in which he buried what he called kill kits all over the United States of America, the locations of which were kept only in his mind. These were 5-gallon Home Depot buckets that he stuffed with zip ties, guns, ammunition, cash from bank robberies he had committed, and Drano to accelerate human decomposition. when Israel Keys, who was otherwise a very devoted single dad to a 10-year-old daughter and who lived with his longtime girlfriend in Anchorage, Alaska, felt the urge to kill, he would board a commercial flight. He would rip out his cell phone battery. He would go dark, as he called it. From that moment on, he's only using cash. He's flying into a major hub. He's then renting a car. He's digging up one of these kill kits, and now he's going on the hunt. And he will take anybody. You could be young, old, black, white, thin, fat, rich, poor. You could be in a couple. You could be a mother-daughter. It didn't matter. In fact, he liked taking pairs. That was much more of a challenge. He would then abduct these people, sometimes in broad daylight from public places, sometimes from the safety of their own bedrooms at night. He would move them to another location where he would rape and torture and kill them. He would expertly dispose of the remains. He never left any DNA or evidence behind. He would then get in that car and put hundreds, if not thousands of miles between himself and that last known crime scene. So he operated at least for 14 years, I think much longer, undetected throughout the United States of America and Canada and a few other countries. But the focus of his killing was the continental United States.
It's incredible. It's like it's one of those things where, the cliche truth is stranger than fiction. I feel like that this book and Israel Keys as a concept is stranger than fiction, really. And the book reads so much like the unfolding of a great novel, which I think, both of us very much aspire to in our writing, to make something, nonfiction. You're stymied by the information that you have. You can't get into people's heads unless you have their diaries and you have supporting evidence. If you don't have the primary documentation or even, the secondary documentation, it can be very hard to put together a story. And in my case, I had diaries and an unpublished book, et cetera, and still faced issues where I didn't know so much. And in your case, you had tons of filings of your access to, like you said, a psych eval. You got actually like face-to-face interviews. So, I'm interested, in terms of your experience with putting together this wide-ranging narrative that touches on so many different places and people, and such gruesomeness. Like, what were the kind of challenges you faced in the research side of putting this together and to make it so novelistic?
The one great thing was the FBI gave me unprecedented access to their agents. So I would spend, hours a week talking to the people who work the case most closely. And I wanted them to be real flesh and blood characters. And I wanted to know what they were thinking at any given moment in the investigation. I wanted to know their little quirks. I remember the lead agent talking to me about how embarrassed he was that every morning he would go buy like an $8 cappuccino, and everybody would make fun of him for that. And those were the really granular details that I thought really humanized these people who otherwise we think of as these tropes we see on police procedurals or in Hollywood movies. Then I really came up against it when they stopped talking to me. And so I had to go another way, and that was through documentation. And that was, while a whole other way to try to crack some of these mysteries, it was also incredibly gratifying. These were documents that I fought for and got unsealed, but these were the ones that were like, here are emails, phone calls to tip lines, desperate messages from law enforcement all over the country, from family members and friends all over the country saying, please look into the death of my loved one or the disappearance of my loved one. It fits Israel Keys. And then I got the FBI's secret internal timeline of his travels around the country. And it became this jigsaw puzzle of putting together which cold cases, some of which are very famous, are very likely the work of Israel Keys. And so a few of those are explored in the book, and hopefully will be reopened, because I do think several of them are solvable for sure. To you, I wanted to ask, at what point, you sort of talked about the difficulties in nonfiction of trying to get inside the head of your protagonists or your characters, which is what they become. Even when you're reading Rosenhan's unpublished book or diary entries, is there a part of you going, I don't know, this guy is maybe an unreliable narrator? Or is another part of you going, I really want to like this character so much, can I allow this maybe unpleasant truth in?
I think, I think it was a combination of both those two things. So, David Rosenhan, who is the author of this study that I wrote the book about, he died before I started writing the book, about I would say 6 months to a year before I started even heard about the study, really. So that was a huge barrier. I mean, in some ways it's a freedom, right? When you're writing about someone who's dead. But there are so many times that I just wished I could just have 5 minutes with him. I mean, I would have dreams that he would show up and talk to me. And a few of them, especially when I had started to really suspect that things were not as they seemed, that he was, I'm being very kind, but an unreliable narrator. I actually had a dream that he visited me. Actually, it was in a church, very complicated, but no one likes to hear about dreams. But he visited me and gave me permission to write the book.
Wow.
Yeah. Because this was 6 years of my life, and I really embedded myself in his world and became very, very, very close friends with his closest friends. I mean, he's the kind of guy, everyone told me he would have loved you. He would have loved you. I knew that if we would have met, we would have gotten along. He was a raconteur. He was funny. He was very smart. I know that we would have gotten along, and by extension, his extended group of friends, I did get along with. And I had a close relationship and have a close relationship with his son. So it's also this question of what do you owe, the people who are left behind. And I felt that I owed fairness and a rigorousness of trying to find any other explanation that explained the issues with the study that I uncovered that might be more favorable. Like I really went into this first as a fan, and then I was disillusioned and actually angry. And then I kind of came to terms with it. And I remember you read an early draft of it. I don't know if you recall this, you read various drafts. And you were saying you're too easy on him.
I feel like I said that on every draft I read. I was such a product of Catholic school.
I know, but I know. It was helpful, but it was really interesting because then I had you have a real strength of your convictions, which I really admire. I'm more of a waffler a bit. And so I had you read it, and then I had his closest friend, Florence Keller, who is the owner of the files and who has become a very close friend of mine as well. And so I had both of, and she thought I was too hard on him. So I had these two conflicting voices, and I really, I was trying to navigate it in a way that felt honest to me and how I felt about it. And it went through, of course I changed the way I feel about it sometimes. Like I just got various emails from people in the medical ethics community who want this study retracted. And a part of me feels very vindicated by that, because I think all that work that I did actually will be, it will come to fruition to actually change something, like something will be done. I mean, of course, the issues that this study created or helped create still happened. It's not going to change the fact that psychiatric hospitals closed en masse, that there are droves of people who are very seriously ill and homeless on the street. It's not going to change this kind of very biological focus in psychiatry that I feel was a bit of an overkill reaction. Not going to change any of that, but I thought, I felt vindicated. But as I started to think about it, I don't necessarily want it to be retracted. So I'm still waffling even now.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
Why don't you want it to be retracted?
Well, I feel like it's a little bit dishonest to say now, okay, we're retracting a study that already had an effect. That's mainly what I feel. I also feel like it's a bit of kicking a dead horse. Like I feel like I made my case pretty solidly in this book, and anyone who's interested in this study will probably come across my book. However, someone made the point, who I very much respect, that it might not change the way this is taught. It's still taught in a lot of Psych 101 classes. It's still taught in sociology courses all over the country. It's a mainstay course, and I know it's still being taught because I get emails from people who say that their teacher still teaches it, the way before my book, that it's just completely true. So if you have an asterisk, with the study saying this should be retracted, I feel like, so now I'm kind of feeling like maybe it should be retracted. But my initial response was a bit, oh no, don't do that. It's just so funny.
It's
right?
so interesting. I feel like your book, when I got to the end of it, I was like, this book is so important. This book should really have a sort of tectonic explosion in the field. And with my book, I thought, okay, I think identified several victims that still remain cold cases or missing persons. And I think there's this hope when your book comes out, and again, in the before times, yes. That it's going to change things like that. And I think part of it is our just background as investigative journalists. There's a part of the DNA of that where it's just, you sort of want wrongdoings exposed and you want change as a result of that. And in fact, things just move so much more slowly. Totally. So much more slowly. And I don't, by the way, you described yourself as a waffler. I don't think that at all. I think you are very judicious and you take your time in trying to think things through, and I think you really treated Rosenhan with as much fairness and humanity as you possibly could, while also really elucidating and really beautifully writing about the horrors of mental institutions and the way that we warehouse people still, how we really still don't know what to do with them. And it's a thing nobody wants to believe, whether you're in the field or a lay person, because the alternative is just too horrific. And I think that's also part of the legacy and the long tail of your book. It's still a mystery.
What do you hope happens? I mean, I know, of course, closing some of these cases. Mm-hmm. Are there specific cases that you hope get an answer that really bother you, keep you up at night?
Yeah. There are two little girls, independent of each other, who were murdered in Colville, Washington, which is an extremely small, remote town. One was only 12, and she was missing her feet. She had prosthetic feet. And Israel Keyes lived there at the time and was seen with her right before she disappeared. I have always thought that he was responsible for that. And in fact, when I went and listened to one of the last interviews the FBI did with him, he was asked about that case in a very tentative way. And he feigned disinterest in it and said he had thought he kind of heard something about it, but it just didn't really catch his attention, which to me is the hugest red flag. I mean, he was exhibiting psychopathic behavior from a very, very, very young age. So this would have been exactly the kind of crime that would have obsessed him. He would have known all about it. It was the biggest story there. So those two young girls, there is a missing man in Texas named Jimmy Tidwell, who one of the lead FBI agents on the case, Jeff Bell, he would speak with me about a missing person in Texas often, and he would never identify the person. He said he was reluctant to do so because there were survivors, and if they can't prove it, why put the family through that? But I think there's plenty of evidence now. And then lastly, this is another one, there are several more in the book. There was a serial predator in Boca Raton known as the Boca Killer, who targeted women and their very young children. These cases are horrific. They are bone chilling. They took place in broad daylight. And Keyes had a lot of rage towards his mother. And it would make sense to me that a killer like him would target mothers and young children. And in fact, the lone surviving witness, would-be victim, who was abducted by the Boca Killer, worked up a sketch. To this day, by the way, she's only known as Jane Doe. She's never revealed her identity. This is how terrified she was. She worked up a sketch with a police artist. It is a dead ringer for Israel Keyes.
I can't remember, because I remember in the draft, one of the drafts I read of the book, you had the drawing.
Police
sketch. Do you have it in the book?
It's not in the book, but you can easily Google it. Boca Killer, Israel Keys, side by
It's,
side.
it's spitting image. It's
Spitting image.
It's wild. And he was often in Florida during that time.
He was often in Florida. And the other thing that tipped me off about Boca Killer potentially being Keys was Jeff Bell often talked about Florida. He would insert it in conversations any way he could. He would be like, say you're active in Florida, or say you're vacationing in Florida. Florida was his go-to state. And it was sort of like a light bulb moment when I read about the Boca Killer.
It's amazing. It's amazing.
Yeah.
You know, I think that ultimately, and I think you had mentioned about my book too, this idea of a long tail, you know, I do think hopefully that both of our books, like, you know, there are various dreams that you can have for books. Some of the dream is that it's a huge, massive, crazy bestseller and it's, you know, takes over the world, and then there are other kind of a little bit quieter hopes that you hope that your book remains on the shelf for many years and that the right people read it and really are moved and changed by it. And in your case, might even get an answer to a loved one's death that was a horrific kind of death. So, you know, I think that that's my hope for my book, is that, you know, that it stays in the kind of greater consciousness for a long time and is part of a greater debate about some of these issues that we started the conversation about in the beginning, which is, you know, what is mental illness? And, you know, I mean, I think that what's going to be interesting for you, the trajectory of American Predator, is that I think without a doubt, this is going to be a documentary and a movie at some point. And it will be interesting to see what those mediums kind of bring in terms of the widening of knowledge about this person and maybe kind of gathering new information for people who maybe, you know, oh yeah, I remember seeing that guy actually, and being able to place him in certain areas. So I mean, I'm sure that you're looking forward to that aspect of.
Oh, 100%. I mean, documentary and unscripted, when it comes to true crime, you know, we see the real world impact that these series have been having. And I think that, yeah, you sort of pierce another layer of public consciousness. You move the case along, hopefully. And you know, this is a case that the FBI, they teach around the country to law enforcement.
Amazing.
Many of whom have no idea this guy existed. And it really is one of the most educational cases that there is in terms of law enforcement. And so, I mean, my hope with my book is the same that you have for yours, which is like, it has sort of a lasting, long-term, movable impact, you know? And I think that's like the best you could hope for with nonfiction.
I completely agree. Now, before we open it up to questions, which I think we're going to do shortly, I did say that we would have a Housewives link to everything. Because, you know, Maureen had gotten me into first Vanderpump Rules and then the greater Housewives universe, specifically New York and Beverly Hills. When I was pregnant with twins, I finally decided, okay, I'm going to follow Maureen's advice and watch these shows. And it's been real enriching. It's been a wonderful part of my life. So how our love of Housewives, I'm throwing this out to you, a strange question. So how does our love of Housewives dovetail with our interest in the books that we've picked?
Oh, this to me is easy
Okay.
answer. Okay. It's all about interpersonal psychodynamics
Mm-hmm.
and the difference between an aggressively constructed, architected image and the true self beneath.
Absolutely.
And I think that, like, there are far fewer, I can't think of much more that in terms of like psychodynamics is as interesting, because that, you know, as sort of constructed as these worlds are, you know, it's real stuff. And I think one of the things that, you know, there are arguments about, well, isn't it sort of a misogynistic universe? And actually Camille Paglia, who's controversial in that realm, has argued for Housewives, because what it really gets at is something that's so distinctly female. Like, I don't like the word microaggression. I don't like the word trigger, but those are things that I think are very specific to female friendships and relationships. You know, levels of competition that are subterranean, that are very difficult to, they're slippery and they're difficult to identify, but if you catch it by its tail and you nail someone to the wall, I mean, we've been in training since kindergarten for this kind of stuff, right? And so to
Oh,
see
totally.
it play out
And it's
among
a petri dish of all sorts of those kind of behaviors in what I also love about Housewives, which I think does actually correspond to our interest in nonfiction, is the layeredness of the universe of Housewives. Because, you know, if you watch it on, almost anyone could watch it on one level. It's, you know, pretty much rich women behaving badly.
yes,
But it's not, it's so much more, because each person has their agenda, has their narrative that they want seen. And those narratives are often competing. And then you have the second layer of the producer's narrative that they want. And then you have Andy Cohen's layer.
right.
So you have these competing narratives and kind of this question of what is truth, really, that kind of emerges from the muck that is Housewives, which I
To
just...
say nothing of the editors, the role of the editors,
have a huge outsized role, because we heard one was just fired for basically saying that she gave someone a bad edit because she found her annoying.
Exactly. And there was another key part of a narrative left out in Beverly Hills, in which a key interaction had been left on the cutting room floor, which gave one character much more cover for not being as manipulative as she had been in a certain situation. And these are sometimes very high stakes situations. I mean, there have been divorces on this show. There have been suicides on this show. There have been allegations of domestic violence. There have been serious substance abuse issues. And I do really enjoy that veil of, here's what I'm presenting and here's what's actually going on. And as you said, it's also a game show, right? It's Coliseum level, gladiatorial. Who makes it to the next season? Who gets the center position and the cast?
That's Andy Cohen on the reunions.
Who gets to sit next to Andy at the reunions? Yeah.
So anyway, I had to ask that because it's something that Maureen and I have a debriefing every week. We talk Housewives. So now we're doing it publicly.
Well, it was really smart of you to link it to this. I never would have thought that.
Well, I think this is a good time to open it up to questions if you all have any questions that you'd like to ask.
Yeah, and you can continue to ask questions using the chat. You can send me questions at any time, and I encourage it. We do have one question. How do your books conceptualize the difference in psychopathy and psychosis, and the difference in personality disorders versus psychotic disorders? So the questioner asks, they hope it's not too broad, but I think it's difficult to ask a question about two books that have that kind of linkage. So, but I think I see what the thrust is there, that drilling down in both of your books on trying to find these sort of gradations.
Absolutely, and definitions matter, So, I mean, psychopathy and psychosis are completely different things, just to put that straightforwardly. Psychopathy is among the personality disorders. Psychosis is a symptom. It's an experience of hallucinations, delusions, etc. Hearing voices would be an example of psychosis. Psychopathy is, Maureen would be an expert in the definition of psychopathy. I'll let you take that. But so we're talking about completely distinct things there. They sound similar, but very distinct. And in terms of the world of The Great Pretender, I am personally I'm casually very interested in personality disorders, but my book is very much interested in psychotic disorders and things that are typically grouped together as, I hate these words because I don't agree with them, but they're typically seen as more organic illnesses. The DSM separates them out in terms of different axes. And so personality disorders and psychiatric disorders are actually on different axes. They're completely separate as well. I think does that explain it properly? So I'm very much interested in psychiatric disorders, and I think Maureen in her book is definitely more interested in personality disorders. I think if you were to say that broadly, I think our books maybe reflect that, right?
Yeah, I would agree with that completely. I mean, I'm most interested in psychopathy, especially as it relates to Israel Keys and the FBI's efforts to understand him. Psychopathy exists on a spectrum. So you can be a psychopath, which means basically you don't have real emotion. You know the difference between right and wrong, and you don't care. You operate completely out of self-interest, and you are basically wearing a mask from sun up till sundown. You are imitating what it is to be human. Some psychopaths channel their this disorder in productive ways. They become fighter pilots. They become surgeons. They have such a high threshold for tension, for life and death situations that it just doesn't affect them emotionally or psychologically. Keyes obviously exists on the very far end of the spectrum of psychopathy, where he is interested in nothing but hunting, torturing, and killing human beings, and in getting better and better and better at it. One of the interesting things I learned through writing this book is that, you know, even the FBI has such a crude understanding of this that they have a secret facility called the Evil Minds Research Museum. And there they study the brains of serial killers. They are really still trying to figure out, are they born or made? And Keyes is among the ones studied there currently.
But you couldn't get in to see it because you were told it didn't exist when you tried to.
They invited me down, and then when I got there, they told me it didn't exist. It wasn't very smooth. I thought the FBI could have had a better cover story, but that's okay.
Yeah, I think so too. And I do think it's interesting that you do mention this idea of a spectrum, which is very important, I think, to both psychiatric disorders and personality disorders. You know, someone who is, you know, let's say someone who has been diagnosed with schizophrenia does not always kind of present with the kind of typical symptoms of schizophrenia, which, by the way, are very broad. And one person with schizophrenia may look nothing like another person with schizophrenia, but it is a spectrum. These are all, there's not one presentation, there's not one degree of presentation. There's a wide range. And the same thing with psychopathy. It is very much a reflection of that spectrum as well.
I have a question following up on that. Maureen, you mentioned that Israel Keyes' case is used now sort of instructively, and that it was kind of baffling previous models of profiling. And I'm wondering if in your access with the FBI, of course, I maybe am among a few people who got into the canceled too soon series Mindhunter, which sort of dramatized the early days of profiling, but profiling also in recent years has sort of been sort of alluded to as incredibly specious and without a lot of rigor. And so I'm wondering what it was like, what the sort of shakeup was like for a case like Keyes to kind of shake those sort of maybe received models of profiling. And then to try to connect this to Susannah's book as well, both of your books are sort of talking about cases that challenge that kind of orthodoxy or received knowledge. And what is it like as journalists or investigators or writers to kind of, especially now in this time, we're also sort of dealing with sort of a public understanding of how slowly science is able to move along. What is it like to be on the, sort of the front lines of that as writers?
Well, to your first question, that's such a great link, you know, the moment we're in right now and realizing how slowly science actually can move. When it comes to the FBI discovering the existence of a Keyes, for example, and calling Quantico and saying, listen in and tell us what to say so we can get information. That's literally how reliant they had come to be on this mythological institution. Like, give us a script and we'll get more victims. And to have them listen in and come back and say, we don't know what to tell you, we've never seen one like this before, basically shakes the entire field down to its studs, right? You also then have Keyes telling them later in the investigation, you know, they're asking how he developed this unprecedented modus operandi. And he says to them, I learned from you guys. They were shocked to hear that he read Mindhunter. When he was 14, he read John Douglas's Mindhunter. He read Dark Dreams by the equally legendary profiler Roy Hazelwood. He said, you know, I watch procedurals. I watch CSI. I learn exactly what not to do. And then he said, if you think I'm dangerous, there's one behind me that's even better because you haven't caught him yet. So I think it's done a lot to humble, I think, the FBI's criminal profilers in the sense that, you know, we are helping, as I say in the book, as a society and as a culture to build better monsters.
Yeah, no, I thought that was something that I thought was pretty terrifying, that idea that there is someone better waiting in the wings in terms of better serial killer was pretty scary takeaway from your book. But in terms of that connection to COVID now and the kind of progress in science, which was amazing to me coming from Brain on Fire, which was my experience with an autoimmune disease in my brain, I had a very, appropriately rosy and opportunistic look at science and progress, because I'm, sitting here as an example of, neuroscience making a breakthrough and what can happen. So of course I'd be optimistic and feel very kind of confident about where science is heading. And then what I started to do was as Brain on Fire, reached more and more people, I became aware of how many, people who maybe didn't have autoimmune encephalitis like I did, but were equally suffering and maybe had very similar symptoms on top of it, were not getting answers. We're still sick, we're marginalized or ignored. In some cases, they would even say abused. And so it made me realize that with every case like mine that shows the kind of potential, there are cases going on right now which shows how regressive it is. And so I think COVID unfurling before our eyes shows that progress in science is not linear. And even if we have kind of amazing breakthroughs that are going on right now, we're still like very primitive in a lot of the ways, especially when we're thinking about the mind brain. So and I see kind of Brain on Fire, for me, it was, The Great Pretender is a kind of re-education after Brain on Fire. It's kind of an expansion of, okay, that was one singular experience, and broadening it out shows how far more complicated and in many cases, how upsetting, frankly, some of the lack of progress has been.
Thank you. Another question from our guests. For Maureen, there's two questions here. For Maureen, how do you think Israel Keyes is the serial killer we've never heard of compared to others who have had so much more media attention? And for Susannah, have those doctors in Boston who originally told you the study reached out to you and given you their thoughts on the book?
I think the reason more people don't know about Israel Keyes is fairly simple. At a certain point in the investigation, the FBI, after having kept his very existence a secret for about 9 months, went to the public and asked for help to identify and locate other victims. They very quickly scaled this profile down. They clawed this case back from public view. And then as I began reporting the book, and at a certain point, some of the agents on the case realized they told me more than they meant to. And now I knew things that they were regretful that I knew. And they couldn't put you couldn't put the toothpaste back in the tube. They really have gone to pretty great lengths to keep to a very specific narrative. And I do think too that because there were so many missteps made in this investigation, really which came down to just human ego and hubris and a desire to be part of the case that was really a career maker. It was going to make people stars, the way like the OJ case made people stars. And because of that, there were so many missteps along the way that really hampered them identifying and locating other victims. And so it's in a lot of ways, it's a huge black eye. If they were to admit there are these many cold cases because they screwed up, that's not really great. So I do think that's the reason.
I would add to that, Maureen.
Yeah.
I don't want to give away a plot point in the book. Is that okay to do?
Yeah, go ahead. I trust you.
Everyone okay with that? I don't know. He killed himself. That will stop interest right there. And they were embarrassed about it because they let him kill himself in prison. So there was a lot to hide. Instead of
yes. And to that, I would also just add, when Jeffrey Epstein killed himself, the first thing I thought about was Israel Keyes. Because in both of these cases, at the time of their incarceration, these individuals were probably the highest value suspects the federal government had in custody.
What does that say?
Yeah, and both were allowed to suicide, or suicide in Jeffrey Epstein's case, depending on what you believe. But it really, that was yet another mystery how that was allowed to happen, and that's explored in the book. But yes, 100%.
And there's a word that you use that I think, again, a through line between our books is hubris.
Yeah. Yes.
It's really the corrosive power of hubris. And
yes,
it's seen in my book, it's seen in your book, and institutional hubris too.
Male institutional hubris.
Yep.
So what about the reaction to your book?
Oh, yes. So for people who haven't read The Great Pretender, this kind of odyssey, for lack of a better word, was kind of launched when two wonderful doctors out of MIT, Harvard area, McLean Hospital, one who studies the NMDA receptor, who is obviously interested in the disease that struck me because that affects the NMDA receptor, and another woman who I interviewed for an article that I wrote about schizophrenia. We went out to dinner after a book event, and they had suggested at some point, because I told them this story that had really haunted me about a young woman who had all the same symptoms that I did. I was speaking at a psychiatric hospital about my condition, and the doctor came up to us and said, "We have a woman here who sounds exactly like Susannah." And a few weeks later, I found out she had tested positive for the same illness that I had. But the big difference was that she was misdiagnosed for 2 years and would never recover. And so I told them this story, and Deborah Levy, who was one of the doctors, turned to me and said, "This is like the study on being sane in insane places," which is the subject of The Great Pretender. And so that's kind of set me off on the book Odyssey. Deborah Levy loves the book, which I'm very happy about. And I think that, she is very much in some ways like a true believer in the powers of psychiatry. And I thought I was kind of worried about her response to the book, but I think that she thinks I was fair and that I exposed the limitations that are there in ways that I think that some ways she probably disagrees with me, in many ways that she agrees with me. Dr. Joe Coyle, from what I understand, also really enjoyed the book. So I'm very happy that the people who kind of started me off on this journey ended up enjoying the outcome. Yeah.
Great. We got time for a couple more questions. There's another question for both. How do you balance writing and investigating subjects that can be so disturbing without going to a dark place? Thinking of recent excellent HBO series on Michelle McNamara's I'll Be Gone in the Dark.
Ah, really good question. I mean, I don't know, Maureen, I did worry about you a little bit because I'd read your book and I was alone upstate and I was too scared to read it, and it terrified me. So in mine, and the kind of study of serious mental illness and the history of that is can be very dark and upsetting. I think the kind of joy of the curiosity of trying to unearth a mystery kept me from veering off to that dark place. I think that journalistic curiosity was the thing that kept me grounded, I think, throughout it, even when faced with some pretty terrible topics.
I feel the same way. I think that's absolutely right. I don't think I would have been able to articulate it that way before, but there's something about it's your journalistic drive to solve these mysteries or answer these questions or get people to tell you things they maybe don't want to tell you. The other thing for me was that I was definitely 1 to 2 steps removed from this investigation. I didn't see some of the things that these people saw and that they'll never forget. Like, for example, the photo of his last known victim, an 18-year-old barista named Samantha Koenig. Now, when he had her, and the FBI didn't know whether she was alive or dead, despite having found a ransom photo that Keyes took of Samantha Koenig. She was looking straight at the camera. She was wearing makeup. Her hair had been braided. And they looked at this photo and they didn't know if she was alive or dead. That photo has never been released and it should never be released. I didn't have to see that. I think if I had seen something like that, it might have gotten into my psyche a little bit more than it really did. Like I for the most part, I approaching it very much as a journalist.
But I will add, sorry, not to, but Israel Keyes did show up in your dreams too.
This is true. But he let me go.
David Roseanne let me write
a ride.
We get permission. Self-fulfilling or self.
Yeah, it's true.
True.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm just if someone I was researching showed up in my dreams, I would, and he was a serial killer. Yeah.
Specifically, the serial killer would be a little bit disturbing, I think, to have.
Yeah. He was kind of a good-looking serial killer.
He's a foxy guy, actually.
Yeah.
I hate to say it, but he is or was.
I think we'll close with the standard book-selling question, which is, I'm curious to know what both of you are reading right now.
Okay, don't ask me why. I think it's a reaction to COVID. I'm taking a class, like one of those Coursera classes, those free classes out of UPenn on Greek and Roman mythology. So I'm reading the Odyssey. I just used the word Odyssey too, probably because of that. But I'm reading the Odyssey right now, which I'm very much enjoying. And I'm also reading Ottessa Moshfegh. Is that how you say her name? Ottessa Moshfegh, right? I'm reading her newest book as well.
I am just finishing up a book that has not come out yet that Susannah has also read. It's by the great Ada Calhoun.
Oh, you're reading
her
that?
next book.
Oh, it's so good.
Called Also a Poet, and it's a dual sort of narrative. It's a memoir of her relationship with her father, who is a very well-known writer, and his inability to sort of finish this biography of the poet Frank O'Hara, and she sort of takes this on. And it's so good and so beautifully written, and she so vividly captures this world that I think all of us who come to New York and are creative are obsessed with. That sort of 60s era, the beats, the artists, the Cedar Tavern crowd, you know, she really captures this sort of lost bohemia so vividly and wonderfully. And so it's also kind of a love letter to New York, which is a wonderful thing right now since New York is sort of asleep at the moment.
It's amazing. It's an amazing, I mean, that book, I'm so excited for that book to come out. I'm so glad you're reading it. I'm so glad to hear you're enjoying it as much as I do.
It's wonderful.
It's a wonderful book.
Susannah, someone in the chat wants to know which edition of the Odyssey. I'm curious if it's the
Robert
Emily Wilson. Oh, okay.
Robert Vegas, which is, it's great. I hate to use this. I'm not going to use this, but I feel like it's so readable. It's almost like kind of reading an action movie. It's like reading about an action movie. Yeah, it's really vivid. And I tried. I think I took Latin in high school, and I was not up to snuff. And I think I was trying to translate that, and I had no idea what was going on. So it's been really joyous to go back and actually understand what is going on. And so, and there's so many things that I'm now seeing. I actually just read another book I'm in the process of reading and reviewing is a book called Fathoms. And it's about whales, and it's poetry. I mean, it's a gorgeous book. I think it's going to be out next week. And she talks about the Odyssey in there and the sirens. And I felt very vindicated for my decision to actually reread it, because I've seen it multiple times, just things referenced in, and it's nice to have that foundational knowledge of that book.
Well, you can purchase the Odyssey. You can purchase all the books Susannah and Maureen mentioned at Literati Bookstore. You can also purchase their books, and we encourage you to do that. Once again, I've put links in the chat where you can do that. And if you're watching on YouTube, you can buy them in the description below. That was such a wonderful, wide-ranging, engrossing conversation. Thank you both so much for joining us virtually and in Ann Arbor and points all over the country from there. Thank you so much for being here tonight. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. It was wonderful.
Yeah, this is fantastic. Thanks for giving us the opportunity to have this in this time right now. So that was, of
course,
wonderful.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Stay safe in New York, and we'll see you hopefully in Ann Arbor soon. And everybody else, take care, and we'll see you at our next event. Thanks, folks.
Bye.
Bye.